Thank you for joining the RIETI webinar. I'm Fukuoka Noriyoshi, Consulting Fellow, RIETI, and the Principal Deputy Director, Trade Policy Bureau METI, and I will be serving as the moderator. Today, we are truly honored to welcome Dr. Gill Pratt, Chief Scientist, Toyota Motor Corporation and CEO, Toyota Research Institute. The title of today's presentation is Thoughts about Organization from DARPA to Toyota. We will listen to his presentation for 20 minutes or so, and then ask Mr. Hirohide, Consulting Fellow, RIETI, and Special Advisor, former Vice Minister for International Affairs, METI, to give some comments and discussion with Dr. Pratt for 20 minutes. Dr. Pratt, please start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Give me a moment to share my screen. Today, I'm going to talk to you about DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a very important innovation center for the Defense Department within the US. And the slides that I will use are actually identical with only a few small changes to slides that I used 7 years ago, almost to the same day 7 years ago, when I was convincing TMC, Toyota Motor Corporation, to start the Toyota Research Institute in Silicon Valley in the US. And I was giving them the lessons that I learned from DARPA and how I thought that Toyota could use those same lessons in starting a research institute like TRI. So I hope this will be helpful to all of you. Let me begin by talking a little bit, in this case, of an example of a certain kind of innovation that was already happening in Toyota, and that I think happens in many, many companies, especially in Japan. So the example I used was the car called the Corona, and I showed its progression in a number of years from 1957 all of the way to 2002. And I asked a question of what this development was like, and I plotted it on two axes, one being, of course, time, and the other one being sophistication. And I asked what kind of sophistication improvement this was. And the answer was a kind of a standard Kaizen, that ever better cars and continuous improvement, but essentially linear improvement. Of course, the car in 2002 is much better than the car in 1957, but it's not a discontinuity. It's not a disruption. It's not completely different, so you wouldn't recognize it. Essentially linear improvement. And then I contrasted that with the evolution of cell phones. If you take a look at the history, and again, this talk was originally given 7 years ago, of the history of cell phones over 30 years, and look at what it was like at that time, 9 years before, there was this incredible disruption that occurred 9 years prior, when we went from essentially sort of single-use phones to smartphones that had multiple uses. And in fact, the evolution, if you look at it, was much more exponential. At the very beginning, for the first 20 years or so, there were small improvements. And then over the past years, the improvements have accelerated tremendously. This not only applies, of course, in the cell phone business, but in general, because of Moore's law and laws that are like that. In this case, taking a look at computer progress, there's exponential growth in terms of computing power versus time. So this is a very, very well-known phenomenon. And so the question that I asked was whether linear progress, the standard Kaizen process, could that compete in the long term with exponential growth that we were seeing in some industries? And I think the answer to that question is no. It doesn't matter what the scale is of these two different curves. Eventually, the exponential curve crosses over the linear curve and exceeds it. And so the question is, how much of a problem is this going to be for Toyota in the future? That was the question that I asked and presented 7 years ago. And the answer was that it was a problem and we needed to find another way, not just the usual way of Kaizen. So then I started talking about DARPA and how this exact same realization happened starting in 1957. Many of you may know the history of the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that in 1957 there was this kind of sudden advance that was happening in the Soviet Union where they launched the first man-made satellite called Sputnik. As a result of that incredibly disruptive advance in our competitor, President Eisenhower actually decided that he needed to change the way that research and development was done for defense within the US, and he founded DARPA. And the purpose of DARPA was specifically to address these kinds of disruptive changes, which he called strategic surprise. In which way could we have R&D prevent the United States from becoming surprised strategically by other nations? And so the first thing that DARPA actually did, and this is not well known, was to work on one of the world's best rocket engines at the time, which was the F-1 engine. And it was actually the first activity DARPA did. And then NASA was actually a spin-out from this effort. And it resulted in a very small number of years, only 9 years later, in the successful flight of the Saturn V rocket. And then 2 years after that, of course, the flight landing people on the moon. DARPA, of course, has done many things. I'm only going to present very few of them here, but the Global Positioning System is another incredible achievement that you can trace back to work that DARPA did all the way back starting in the 1960s in putting up some of the first satellites that could be used for navigation. And then, of course, in 1969 was the DARPA-funded development of what was called the ARPANET. In this case, rather remarkable, had only 4 computers connected to it. But the ARPANET led directly to the internet. And of course, the internet today has, millions and millions of computers on it. So this agency has been incredibly effective at meeting that exponential challenge of disruptive change. And so my question to Toyota is, are these kinds of developments that we were seeing 7 years ago the equivalent for Toyota? The Google automated driving effort, the Mobileye effort that was coming out of Israel, the ride sharing effort that was coming from Uber that also included some automated driving efforts. And then finally, Apple has been working on some newer style cars as well, very secretly, but this was a hypothetical car design that was a rumor of what Apple was working on. And my claim is that these kind of developments, these disruptive developments to established players in certain industries are actually a significant threat, very similar to Sputnik. Why was this? Well, my example here is in the car industry, but I think it's true everywhere. 7 years ago, it was true that younger people were becoming more in love with their cell phones than their cars. And it's because the cell phone was a more personal example, an extension of their own persona, and they interacted with it almost the entire day and sometimes in the middle of the night, compared to a car. And cars are only used around 5% of the time. 95% of the time, the car is parked with nobody in it. There's also a change that was happening, and this is even more accelerated now in aging society. Older people drive less, they have less income, and of course, there are going to be fewer driving age people in the future with disposable income to buy personal cars. The entire idea of mobility as a service was another disruptive threat. And this had to do with not actually buying a car, but rather calling up a ride on your phone in order to get from one place to the other. And the result is that the customer doesn't care what model car that they go in. There's no brand loyalty. All that they care about is how well that they can get from one place to the other. Another factor was how mature the industry of car making had become. If you look at different manufacturers, of course, there are some differences, but actually, if you compare it to the past, the differences in quality, the differences in features between different car makers is much smaller now than in the past. And the industry essentially is very mature. Next to last, there are actually many competitors in the automotive industry. It's not an industry that has a very large network effect. A network effect is where the bigger you are, the more competitive you are, but it's kind of extreme, and so it tends to have a market evolve to one or two gigantic players, what is called winner take all. The car industry is not like that. So as a result, even though Toyota is the #1 revenue company, at that time it had only around 12% of the global market, and there are many other car makers all over the world. By contrast, Google, which has a huge network effect because of the accumulation of data, improving the quality of the results, has over 85% of the search market. And then finally, IT companies have significant advantages, both in their technology, in their infrastructure, in their people, how they can attract talent to work on the new technology like software, and finally, in the kind of glamour, which is that if somebody is looking for a job, it seems more glamorous to work for Google or for Apple than to work for a car company. So this is the kind of Sputnik moment for the automotive industry. Now, here's another way of looking at it. And this is kind of looking at the difference between ordinary Kaizen and what is necessary to respond to these exponential challenges. This is a little chart here. The x-axis is different kinds of designs, and the y-axis is kind of how fit a particular design is for the marketplace. So if we take a look at this product, let's take a look at it like a circle that's here. And let's say that as you change the design, as you move around on the x-axis, the fitness goes up, and then you have the optimal design, and then it goes back down as you go off from the optimal design. Well, traditional Kaizen of making things continuously improved lands you back at the top of the peak, and that's very, very good. And it's the traditional way that design has improved for cars. If we expand the x-axis and look at greater designs and ask a question of, well, what if the market shifts? What if people like larger cars or cars with certain features that they didn't want before? Well, you can think about that as the hill has moved. The fitness of what product is the best in the market has shifted from the left side a little bit to the right, and the old design is no longer the best design. And so, of course, if the environment changes slowly, then traditional Kaizen can go ahead and get us back to the top of the peak simply by experimenting and finding what is the better car each time. However, if there is a paradigm shift, let's say that there is a completely different kind of product that the public would like a smartphone instead of a single function phone. And the industry doesn't know about the new product. And let's say that actually there is uncertainty. Should we switch from our old product to the new product? Or let's say there's uncertainty whether to do it or not, but there's many different opinions and there's sort of a lot of conflict. Well, what if it turns out that the new product is actually in a space that would be significantly better than the old product? How do we get over this prediction uncertainty? How do we have the courage to take a leap from the old product to the space of the new product? This is basically the problem with the kind of traditional slow Kaizen process. If I switch this to a two-dimensional graph here, so here we have design on both X and Y, and we sort of have two mountaintops. It's kind of the same curve as before. We can think about this prediction uncertainty being all of the different kinds of products that might be made. And if we try to make one in each direction, it actually may result in failure. And this is very, very frightening for established companies. And I think there is this kind of fear of failure or risk aversion that happens a lot in companies in Japan, particularly older companies. And how is it that we can actually achieve this thing of going to the new market? The answer is not to pretend that we know where the new hill is, because everywhere there is prediction uncertainty. but rather we have to try each one of these different directions in order to get there. And so what I proposed is that our new Toyota Research Institute within Toyota, that our mission was to try each one of these different directions, to be unafraid of failure in order to find the new hills that might be taller than the optimum for the products that we were making now. So that's the fundamental idea. It was exactly the same idea as DARPA. This was DARPA's mission, and I said that it could become TRI's mission within Toyota. So I call this the renewed Kaizen process. It's the same idea as Kaizen, but it includes a willingness to fail. In this case, it's failing 3 times out of 4. In reality, it actually is usually 9 times out of 10 until you finally find the one where you will succeed. And I think this is the most important part of DARPA's mission. DARPA has done incredible things, but most of the time, DARPA fails. And what the DARPA director told me on my first day when I arrived there is that they wanted me to fail. And I said, what do you mean you want me to fail? And what they said to me is, if you are not failing most of the time, you are trying to solve problems that are too easy. If you want to achieve a great success, high reward, you also have to have high risk. And high risk means failing most of the time. And this is very, very difficult for many people to understand, but it's very important. Okay, here's all of the lessons. And I will go through these quickly, but I think it's important. First of all, as I just said, choose high risk, high reward projects. Don't choose projects that duplicate other people's work, and realize that a significant fraction of those high risk projects are going to fail. Some failure is, of course, good, as long as you learn from that failing. And it's also important to focus on a few well-funded projects versus many smaller projects. Sometimes it's said that this is like putting more wood behind fewer arrows, okay? It's very important to establish clear quantitative metrics to measure the progress against objectives. It's very easy to get caught in the trap of kind of making projects that are showcases, that are public relations efforts. And this is a very bad idea because you end up not making real progress. You just have the appearance of progress. Something that was unique about DARPA was that we trusted the program managers very, very much. Each program manager as an individual at DARPA had the authority to decide how to spend approximately $30 million per year. In my case, because I had larger programs, I was one of the people with a bigger budget of around $60 million a year. But it's not the amount that matters so much as the incredible trust that they place in individuals. We pick really good people, and then we trust them in order to make these decisions. The next bullet point is even more important, which is to establish a culture where reporting honestly is more valued than reporting good news. It's very, very tempting for people always to say what is good that is happening. I've been successful here, I've been successful there. But because the culture in DARPA is that 9 times out of 10, we expect projects to fail, if anyone is not reporting roughly 90% failure, we know that they are not telling the truth, or that they are choosing projects that are too easy. And so that's also part of what is expected. They are very highly selective in choosing the staff, and it makes it a kind of a virtuous circle where it's a great honor to be chosen to work for DARPA. And then finally, DARPA had this wonderful situation where we rotated project managers or program managers every 2 to 5 years. And we borrowed them from industry and academia. And after they were done working at DARPA, they were very highly valued to come back to the institution where they worked before. So translating those lessons into Toyota, and maybe this would be helpful in thinking about you. These are answers from 7 years ago, and I won't go into these deeply, but the lessons were, number one, we should become the best company in intelligent vehicles. Number two, we should use our strengths in design and in manufacturing and user interface technology in order to diversify beyond cars. In this case, I gave robotics as an example. I thought, should become a more vertical company. much more similar to Apple as an example. It went all the way from hardware to software to data that software uses. And much more recently, actually after this talk, Apple has moved more into services as well. And I think that vertical companies can be very efficient and really powerful. And then finally, with regard to talent, find a way so that it can be as glamorous to work for Toyota as it is to work for Google, or maybe even more so. And so this is my almost last slide here. It basically gave, especially with regard to finding talent, a number of tips into how to do it. I won't read through this particular slide, but I'll be glad to answer questions with respect to it. But acquisition of talent is a very important thing. It's actually the most important strength that a company has. And with that, I basically pitched 7 years ago that it was important that Toyota establish the equivalent of a very famous organization in the US called the Skunk Works, which was part of Lockheed Corporation, later Lockheed Martin. And they came up with an incredible amount of innovation in the aerospace business. And I thought that this was absolutely essential for Toyota to make those same kind of disruptive, innovative leaps to deal with the exponential challenges of the coming market in the car industry. So with that, let me stop here, and I'll be glad to take your questions and discussion. Thank you so much.